Okay, I'm very happy to be here in this capacity also. What I neglected to do this morning, because I knew he was in constant contact with anyone who's writing a paper, I forgot to say that Amit Karu, who's the assistant director of the Center for Democracy, Toleration, and Religion, is a co-organizer of everything, and if we're all good enough and write good enough papers, he's the co-editor of our volume, and he's been terrific. He's also the co-editor, author of the paper I'm about to present. So when you start having the questions, if you really dislike it, I'll direct some of it to him, but he'll sit up here. Okay? Well, first of all, I want to begin with a slight statement about what is the status of secularism in the context of democracy. It's rather interesting that Robert Dahl, Aaron Leipart, and Juan Linz, the first three winners of the Schittker Prize, called the Nobel Prize of Political Science, have not felt the need to include any discussion of secularism in their definitions of modern democracies, much less of secularism being a necessary condition of democracy. Dahl, in his elaboration of the 8 institutional guarantees that must be created for the functioning of democracy, or what he prefers to call a polyarchy, nowhere mentions secularism. Neither does Leipart in his analysis of the 36 long-standing democracies in the modern world. When Juan Linz and I did the chapter on typology of modern regimes in our book, Problems of Democratic Transition and Consolidation, we also decided not to use the category. And the reason why we didn't use it is that every single one of our 5 types, totalitarian, post-totalitarian, authoritarian, sultanistic, democratic, had lots of regimes that call themselves secular at one time or another. So calling yourself secular, or even the word secular, because you can be very secular and absolutely authoritarian. Now, if you don't give some space for that concept, then you're just assuming that anyone that calls themselves secular is actually democratic, and they're not. Okay. I myself prefer, when discussing democracies and the world's religious systems, to speak of what I call the twin tolerations. By this I refer to the minimal degree of toleration democracy needs from religion and the minimal degree of toleration that religion needs from the state for the polity to be democratic. Religious institutions should not have constitutionally privileged prerogatives which allow them authoritatively to mandate public policy to democratically elected officials, and the minimal degree of toleration religion needs from democracy, if a democracy respects Dahl's 8 institutional guarantees, is not only the complete right to worship, but the freedom of religious individuals and groups to publicly advocate their values in civil society, why not, and to sponsor and organize organizations and movements in political society, like Christian democracy in Europe, as long as their public advancement of these beliefs do not impinge negatively on the liberties of other people and citizens. Okay, now, so I'm going to use it today, secularism, despite that caveat that I don't have to, and that most theorists of religion don't. Most theorists of democracy don't necessarily take it on board. It's just too loaded, too many problems, and so on. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about the multiple secularisms of modern democracies and autocracies, because some of these secularisms are autocracies. And I'm going to talk about ideal types and then continuums. Now, Max Weber, of course, used ideal type to illustrate and analyze distinctive combinations of state-society patterns, such as his ideal type of world-renouncing religions versus world-embracing religious groups, or traditionalist versus charismatic authority. Now, in my own work on democracy, I'll only talk about 3 totally different patterns that are consistent. We'll call them secular. 3 totally different patterns of secularism that are consistent with modern democracies. And it's terribly important we have this in mind, because I see these religious state patterns are as heavily negotiated, and probably they should be constantly renegotiated, as opposed to a fixed normative system. If you're a fixed normative system and your society changes drastically, what could have been functional at time 1 becomes dysfunctional at time 2. And if you don't have political space and capacity to respond to that, well, then you're allowing some normative value that is dysfunctional for democracy and social peace. Okay. Now, let me just give you a simple one. And so many people will talk about total separation of church and state. All right? But what is your list of which countries in the world had the most inclusive democracies in the late second half of the 20th century? Best welfare states, most stable. Clearly, you're going to come up with the entire set of the Scandinavian countries. But what you have to remember about the entire set of Scandinavian countries is every single one of them had an established evangelical Lutheran church. Now, and when they first established these, in about the 16th century, or before, these were not democratic evangelical Lutheran churches. These were totally Caesar papist organizations which sat on top of religion and violated religious liberty. Therefore, in Stepan's sense, they're violating one of the twin tolerations. By the time the 20th century comes along, the same formula, without being changed, is compatible with the twin tolerations. But why? What's in the society that makes this compatible? Well, two conditions. Well, one, you have a more, instead of an absolutist king, you have a social democratic party, but the social democratic party could not have done it if there weren't conditions in society. The conditions in society obviously were that high religious homogeneity, more than 95% of the people in Denmark were evangelical Lutherans, and very low religious intensity. Less than 5% of the people in the last 40 years surveyed have ever gone to church once a week in Denmark. It's one of the low. So all of Scandinavia is low on religious intensity and practice and high on religious homogeneity. Hey, if that's your condition, then you can have an established church until something changes. Now, when you get a Muslim immigration, your homogeneity starts to change, and the Muslim immigration will be more intensely practicing, so that low religious intensity changes, and you have you're at time two, and you better respond to it. Sweden responded to it. Sweden responded to it by starting the disestablishment of the evangelical Lutheran Church in 1995. Denmark didn't. Denmark has outside, but support from outside, a really hardline right-wing party that's really saying they're anti-immigrant, and they don't want any changes in the role of the church. And when the cartoon crisis happened, they couldn't handle it. The Muslim groups asked to speak to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, pressured by his people, said, no, we won't talk with you. Roughly the same type of incident happens in Sweden. Two letters crossed. The Prime Minister is saying, please, the Muslim groups, I'd like to come talk with them, and the Muslim groups are saying, please, we'd like to go talk with the Prime Minister. You had all sorts of channels of communication, and they responded to this well. Okay. Now, if we take a look at a place like India, would this model, Nehru was he was a modernist. He was a social democrat. He was socialist. And he liked a lot of things about Scandinavia. But whenever they looked at that established church, he said, hey, that's crazy. Basically, he knew that they had great religious heterogeneity. The country in the world, it's a it's a Hindu majority country, but it's the second largest Muslim population in India that is of any other country in the world. It's 140 million Muslims. Both sides are intensely religiously practicing by European standards, and you just had about 1 million people die in the partition. Under these circumstances, anything like the Scandinavian model, Nehru said, get it off the table. Gandhi says, get it off the table. Everyone says, get it off the table. And that's important. So this is the contextual ability to analyze your own situation, not to tie into any particular model. That would have been totally inappropriate for them. What do they think of the other major Western model? And there are other Western models, but for many people, when they talk about secularism, they really mean Enlightenment, Third Republic France, 1870 to 1940, and they really mean the 1905 disestablishment of religion, which by European standards is the most religiously hostile act. So then we're in the world, we're taking a look at an ideal type, this type of pretty aggressive secularism, or we'll just call it separation of church and state. And, and then what you often get, so that's an ideal type. And I would say in some senses, many people say that Turkey is in this ideal type. And then at this point, to analyze a statement like that, I think we have to introduce the concept of continuum. We have to look at variation within an ideal type. Okay? So I actually think, and I believe everyone in the room will think within 4 minutes, when I just give you 10 examples, that this is a totally slothfully lazy intellectual assertion to constantly seen in the literature, that the Turkish model of laicité is very similar to the French laicité. It's not. Let me just give you some obvious examples. The first thing would be, as difference, France has no office to write the sermons for all the priests every Sunday, right? Turkey does. An office to write the prayers, the Friday prayers. And until very recent, they were absolutely the same through every mosque in the country. Now they swear. I went to the Diyanet, spent 2 or 3 days there last summer. The Diyanet says, well, we have some provincial variation, but it's still, they're writing every single sermon. That's a big difference right there. Secondly, the people who read, anyone who's authorized to read the state's message at the prayers must be employee of the Diyanet and therefore the Prime Minister's office. So they're all state employees. And if they ever read something that is not exactly as written, there's someone hearing it and recording it, and you're gone. France doesn't have anything like that. Headscarves, people say, well, France has headscarf. Yeah, sure, but there's a huge difference. A huge difference. The French headscarf does not apply to universities. And there's a relatively small percentage of all the women in France who are wearing them anyway, but it does not apply to universities. In Turkey, the headscarves, and they tried to change this, apply to universities. Now, since 60% of the women in Turkey wear a headscarf, this means 60% of the women in Turkey, for all intents and purposes, can never work in the state apparatus, cannot have the best jobs in the private sector, because these require a university degree. And private universities are not allowed. So this is, you really squeeze this. So this is a very gender-loaded, asymmetrical state policy that punishes women, particularly poor women. And it's just massive. You don't get, the headscarf one in France is different. Okay? In France, there's obviously some religious groups are treated less well than others, but no major religious group really cannot build any edifice and cannot practice. Whereas we know, and it came out in the conversation today, that many of the Alevi groups cannot build houses of worship. They have to be in something else, and they often can't practice publicly. And the Sufis, to the extent that they're different, it's the same thing. There's a terrific anti-Sufi tradition at some time, and there's nothing like this in France. In France, you, of course, have a variety of ways in which the state now, in fact, supports religions. In the case of people are still having in their head that the state, it's 1905 and there's no money given for state for a Catholic education. Well, this is really nonsense. As soon as de Gaulle came in 1958, he said, hey, we said, everyone told me that it's modernism, no one's going to be practicing Catholicism after a while, and so on, so we'll only educate people. Well, you know what? Most of our elite still go to Catholic schools, and then they're not given French education, so let's pay 80% of all the religious spending for Catholic high schools. That's been since 1958 and ever since. Okay? And this is just totally unlike the Turkish. I could go on and on. But if you but it is just unacceptable that any of us should ever write something like that in our works again when there's this differences. Okay, I don't necessarily like to use other people's quantitative indicators, but Jonathan Fox has one where he measures 100 countries, more than 100 countries on the world from a scale of 0, no laws controlling majority or minority religions, up to about 40, Saudi Arabia. France gets a score of 5. Which is the highest of the they have 5 laws that control minorities, which is the highest score of any of the 15 original members of the European Union. And Turkey, supposedly exactly the same, gets 14. Okay, so 14. So all the original members are in the sphere of 1 through 5. In terms of controllingness, Turkey is 15. Now, some authoritarian governments who absolutely have a state ideology of secularism, such as Syria, score about the same or a little bit better than Turkey. So this is at the high end of controllingness of religion. Now, so we have to relativize the ideal type and use a continuum, but let's shift on the other side. The other side is Senegal. Okay, you may think, well, why talk about Senegal now? Well, I'm going to talk about Senegal because it's more highly ranked in the last 10 years than Turkey is on either the Freedom House Index of Political Rights or Civil Liberties or the Ted Gur's Polity 3 and Polity 4. It's slightly higher. By the way, 5 other Islamic countries are higher than Turkey. This is important to bear in mind. So many people say, hey, Turkey is a Muslim country. It couldn't possibly be democratic unless you had a lot of controls on it. Well, with that discourse, let's take a look at Senegal. Okay? The preamble and the opening paragraphs in the French, Turkish, and Senegalese constitution are virtually identical as to what they say about secularism. The Senegalese constitution says laïcité. And it just, boom, and you look at it, it's virtually identical, all right? But Senegal, like India, and to some extent like Indonesia, arrived at a mutual accommodation between French and later Senegalese secularists in the state apparatus and the Sufi majority. Over 90% of all the citizens in Senegal are members of one of the 4 major Sufi orders. Osman Kane in the back of the room is a great expert on this, and we may draw him into our conversation sometime. Or if I say something that's horrendously wrong, please correct me. But what's interesting about the Sufi case, and it really is a historical point that needs a lot of research. As far as I know, no one's done this. And I'm always looking for someone who knows Arabic and who knows French. I said, this is the topic. The topic is the French ruled North Africa from Algeria. And the French ruled West Africa from Senegal. Some of the same people were in both places. The French in Senegal adopted a more aggressive form of secularism than was in the Fifth Republic, and really repressed both the state and later the independence leaders totally repressed the Sufis. Senegal, it's a totally different matter. And what's fascinating, and Osman, you've got to tell me, if some of these people were shifted from the Algerian French state apparatus to Senegal. But once they're in Senegal, the French state apparatus starts looking at this. Remember, this is the Third Republic. This is 1880 to 1905. This is when you're about to build it. And there's no formal negotiation, no treaty, so international relations there is going to have nothing to work on. But what you get is people observing the other one's power capacities, what they're doing, and assessing the cost of trying to destroy the other. And both the French laïcité bureaucracy and the potentially jihadists, the Senegalese Sufi groups, come to a decision that everything's okay. Let's just continue doing what we're doing. And so Bamba tells his group that actually we're doing better in terms of churches, in terms of prayers, in terms of order than we've done in the past. And the French say, we can't develop the interior without cooperating. So mutual accommodation starts. So it starts with amazing daring. The French call themselves a Muslim power in French Africa, in West Africa. All their literature calls they're a Muslim power. What does it mean? You're paying money. So this laïcité state, moving towards the hardest thing of 1905, starts to pay people to take the Hajj, get legitimacy that way. They pay for Sufi preachers to learn Arabic. They build some mosque. Okay, that's why they call themselves a Muslim power in West Africa. This isn't anything. It's a totally different strategy. Now, in the process, there's a lot of a tradition of accommodation emerges. Later, you develop rituals of mutual respect. Hundreds of them. and I wrote an article called Rituals of Respect, Sufis and Secularists in Senegal, where I go through all of this. But now what it means then is that you can, and there's an element of this in Indonesia on education, there's an element of this in India, and an element of Senegal, and this is another model that's out there, and that is it legitimate for religious organizations to, and a secular state, to cooperate on some policy? Well, in my twin tolerations, I don't think it's some terrible violation. But what happens is that there's a lot of cooperation. For example, anti-female genital mutilation. The state knew it existed, a little bit less than some other places, but they wanted to do something about it. They asked the Sufi preacher of the major order, look, it can be very hard for us to go in there without your help, but we really need you to make a theological assessment of this situation. What's in the Quran about female genital mutilation? What's in the Quran? What's in the Hadith? Okay, the 43-page report, which was widely circulated, I have a copy of it, if any of you are interested in it, I'm sure Osman does, said the following. There is nothing in the Quran to indicate that God ever told Muhammad that anything like female genital mutilation was required. And then in the Hadiths, there's no evidence whatsoever that the wives and companions of the Prophet and his followers had this case. Then there's a big jump. Therefore, since there's no Quranical base to this, no Hadith base, it's in the area of ijtihad, independent judgment. And independent judgment means that you can then approach correctly, ask medical people, and you just think of what it means to your partner's capacity for normal sexual enjoyment of a marriage to life, their health, and so on. Then he says, what we know of ijtihad is this is an abomination to the health and the happiness of women. So, all good Muslims must campaign against this. And the campaign started. And you went out. And it was much more successful. The secular state don't think they would have lasted more than a week in most of these places if they hadn't gone in with some help from the Sufi orders. And I could give you the same thing on the anti-AIDS policy. I could go in through the same type of discussion for school policy, both in Senegal and Indonesia. And if you're interested in Indonesia, we're having a conference like this in about 3 weeks. Mirjam Kunkler is the co-organizer of that. And our third co-organizer is Azra Murdi. And he was the provost of probably the best university, or one of the absolute best universities, which happened to be an Islamic university in Jakarta. And what he describes in his book on modern education in Muslim countries is a process by which there's constant discussion between some secular state officials and the Ministry of Education and religious officials about whether they can agree on some, and the same thing happened in Senegal. Could they agree on an official version of Muslim history and a translation of the Quran, and that could be taught both in secular schools and religious schools, because it's just a major part of their civilization. They arrived at that in many areas. So whereas you read about Pakistan, where the provincial minister of education says he's not been inside at least half of all of the madrasas or any schools in the Northwest Frontier Province. That's just a no-go area. Whereas in this area, there's no place that's a no-go area. There are one or two places that are much more fundamentalist than you'd like, but basically, people have adopted a common curriculum in many of the cases, and what the common curriculum means is that the state then can give financial support for it. The students, if they graduate, their degree is recognized, so women can graduate from their school and go to university, and parents, all of us as parents are interested in increasing the repertoire of possible actions of our students. So many people are sending their daughters to these schools. Totally unlike the situation in Pakistan. Okay, let me shift to the score, the Fox score on Senegal: Turkey 14, France 5, Senegal 1. Okay, there are other things, symbolic things. If you take a look at, I'm always very interested in religious holidays in any country I go, and I take a look at it. And the religious holidays for minority religions in Turkey, 0. Religious holidays in France for minority religions, 0. Religious holidays for minority religions in Senegal, 6. Religious holidays in what I call support all, finance all, respect all, finance all, principal distance, India, 7 to 10. And in Indonesia, about 7 to 10. It's just a totally different symbolic world, the relationship with the state, and this is important. So basically, where does Turkey fit? Well, Turkey's fit. Obviously, it's not chosen the Indian way, the Senegalese way, or the Indonesian way, but nonetheless, I thought all the stuff he put up there. I mean, basically, I'm a comparative democratic theorist, constantly traveling, going to places, started my life as a foreign correspondent for The Economist. That's a good world he's putting up. In comparative sense, the Turkey world that he put up at the end, that's a good world. It's not the world I've been describing in Senegal or Indonesia, but it's highly unlikely. No, not highly unlikely. Nothing in politics is highly unlikely. But the odds are that the incentives are working in a good direction in Turkey. What do I mean by that? Well, about 35% of the electorate isn't happy either with the AKP or isn't happy with the traditional Ataturkist parties. They're underrepresented, but only 7% of these people who are not totally happy are, if we'll call, are in a more Islamist position than the AKP, and about 30% are in a less Islamist position. So in terms of electoral calculation, and when the Prime Minister said, think of Christian democracy in Europe, and that's what we are, he's saying, I'm a party. I'm an electoral party. Well, if he knows how to count, there are 5 times more votes going in a less Islamist direction than there are going to the Islamist direction, and I assure you, I talked to 3 vice presidents of the parties, they all know how to count. It's unlikely that they have any structural incentives to go in that direction. And then you get a lot of stuff. I mean, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but people are trying to build up an atmosphere that's almost like Chile. And they're talking about that hidden agenda. And it's a fear campaign. So I would call it in theoretical terms, this is the Ataturkist party at the moment, it's unlikely that they're going to win a majority for a long time. Okay? And they feel that the other party is, so they're playing with a regime change agenda. But it's a costly game, and they're in such a worse position than Chile, where I saw people win a change agenda game. And that was based on the fact that the socialists and communists were to the left of Allende and actually doing a whole range of things that frightened the bourgeoisie. So even the Catholic Church, that within 5 years said, we never should have done this, but they supported that coup. The American government totally supported it and was involved in the kidnapping of the neutral commander-in-chief. So you had a huge amount of incentives, and so the bourgeoisie did have the Brummerian moment, where they abdicate their claims to rule and giving it to someone to protect them, Pinochet. I don't think they're going to have a Brummerian moment of that sort in Chile. In Turkey. I don't see it in a sense that the AKP is more cautious and not. Allende was constantly. I interviewed him a lot in '64, and I interviewed him then when he was elected. He was every day. He was being outflanked by people in his own party, doing spontaneous expropriations of haciendas, factories, and so on. Well, that's just not happening here. And so the fear level is less. And then the claim that you're acting constitutionally, even if you're playing an anti-regime game, you've got to argue that the other person is violating the Constitution. Well, if in fact they have so many people in the deep state who've involved with some form of terrorism, then they have sort of less legitimacy in this calculation game. So I think it's interesting, and I'll just finish with. Do I have 2 minutes, or should I stop? My students have heard me say this, but we are talking. This panel is talking about parties, Islam, and democracy in comparative perspective, and people are terrified and just don't look at really simple things. And I'll just say a simple thing: if you just take the entire universe of countries that are 50% Muslim or more, and there are 47, maybe how you count it, but I say 47. And then you do a very simple task. You simply divide those between those that are Arab majority and those that aren't. And then you go into something like Freedom House and Polity and say, let's say 5 years in a row that you're getting the top scores, instead of a 2 on political rights. And you take a long period, 30-year time. 15 countries score higher of the 47, all than any Arab country. So the best Arab country, Lebanon, comes in at about 16th. If in this 30 years, it's higher now in polity, but not in Freedom House. It's 5 on political rights, 5. So methodologically, if you take the entire set, as I did, 47, and you can divide it into two, and then say these two subsets that share a major common variable, in this case the major common variable being Islam, have radically different outcomes. Przeworski says that just taking Islam and just taking Catholicism, both of them are roughly where you would expect they should be by democracy given their socioeconomic income. What does it mean if Adam makes my division between this dichotomy between Arab and non-Arab? Then he would have to say, as I've said in the Journal of Democracy, that the world's largest electorally overperforming group are non-Arab Muslims. What do I mean? Senegal, Mali, Albania, Indonesia, all of these score higher, and the world's largest subset of electorally underperforming given personal income and so on are Arabs. Now, is that an essentialist statement about Arabs? Well, I better write some more because people say it's an essentialist statement. I don't think it's a geographical statement, and you've got to think about it. So, but if I say what contributes to it, and I hope someone writes about it, what contributes to it, but I would say, look, it's called the Arab-Israeli War. Before Bush, I could spend a lot of time in Indonesia without ever hearing anything about the United States, about Senegal. It's a place that loved the United States. After Bush and 9/11 and the war on terror, there's been a certain, but basically these are different subsets. And if you try and say to anyone in Indonesia that they shouldn't pay attention to the Indonesian state, that they're really Muslims and is a pan-Muslim group, any politician would look at him, who's that person? That person will get almost no percent of the vote because Indonesian state and nationalism is on the agenda. So that it doesn't have this pan-Arab, it doesn't have this geopolitical context, and it means that some things, I was one of the founding members of the Human Rights Watch, basically almost all the Muslim majority countries except 4 or 5 election observers, and for a very long time not one Arab country did because the Arab League said don't do it. So now Algeria does and some other places are accepting. But you had at one time 20 of them in the Muslim majority non-Arab world and 0 in the Arab world. So these are political communities. Deutsch used to make a point of political communities. I think they're somewhat political communities. I don't know enough about that to write the article, but I wish some of you would. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Would you like to take the podium? Now comes the tough part.